When you imagine the overwhelming might of the American military, the images that come to mind are usually loud, massive, and heavily armored. You think of the thunderous roar of an F-22 Raptor tearing through the stratosphere. You think of the Abrams tank, 70 tons of steel shaking the earth. You think of the AH-64 Apache, bristling with missiles, a flying fortress designed to absorb enemy fire and deal out absolute devastation. But sheer destructive power is completely useless if you do not know exactly where to apply it. The deadliest weapons in the United States arsenal are blind without a guide. For nearly 5 decades, that guide was a small, nimble, unarmored helicopter that looked entirely out of place on a modern battlefield. It did not have the heavy titanium plating of an Apache. It did not have the speed of a fighter jet. From a distance, it looked more like a civilian news chopper, except for one bizarre feature. A large spherical orb perched precariously on a pole directly above its spinning rotor blades. This is the story of the OH-58 Kiowa Warrior. Born in the jungle. To understand how the Kiowa became the ultimate airborne scout, we have to travel back to a time before laser-guided missiles and thermal imaging. We have to go back to the Vietnam War and the desperate need for a new kind of aircraft. In the early 1960s, the United States Army realized that its existing observation helicopters were too slow, too heavy, and too vulnerable. They launched the Light Observation Helicopter Program, the LOH. The Army wanted a small, lightweight, turbine-powered helicopter that could slip over the jungle canopy, spot enemy troop movements, and call in artillery or larger gunships. Bell Helicopter entered the competition with a prototype called the YOH-4. It was functional, but it was considered underpowered and, frankly, ugly. The Army rejected it, choosing the Hughes OH-6 Caius instead. But Bell didn't scrap their design. They took the airframe back to the drawing board, sleeked it out, increased the cabin size, and marketed it to civilians as the Bell 206A JetRanger. It was a massive commercial success, bought by police departments, news stations, and corporate executives around the world. Meanwhile, the war in Vietnam was escalating faster than anyone had predicted. The Army was losing helicopters at a staggering rate, and Hughes could not produce the OH-6 fast enough to replace them. Desperate for airframes, the Army reopened the bidding process. Bell submitted their newly redesigned JetRanger. This time it won. In 1968, the aircraft was officially designated the OH-58 Kiowa, continuing the Army's tradition of naming its helicopters after Native American tribes. In the jungles of Vietnam, the role of the scout pilot, often called a Loach pilot, a nickname derived from the LOH acronym, was one of the most terrifying jobs in the military. There was no high-tech targeting equipment. A Kiowa pilot's sensor suite consisted of his own 2 eyes and a pair of binoculars. The tactic was brutally simple and incredibly dangerous. The Kiowa would fly just feet above the treetops, actively trying to draw enemy fire. They acted as bait. When the concealed North Vietnamese or Viet Cong troops inevitably opened fire on the small, unarmored helicopter, the Kiowa pilot would drop a colored smoke grenade directly into the enemy position. Hovering high above the Kiowa was a heavily armed AH-1 Cobra gunship. As soon as the Kiowa marked the target with smoke and broke away, the Cobra would dive in, unleashing a torrent of rockets and machine gun fire. It was known as a pink team, the combination of the white scout helicopter and the red attack helicopter. It worked, but the casualty rate for scout pilots was horrific. Surviving in an early Kiowa required profound piloting skill, sharp instincts, and a massive amount of luck. The Army knew that as anti-aircraft technology advanced, the bait tactic would become nothing short of a suicide mission. The magic ball. As the Vietnam War ended and the Cold War deepened, the battlefield arithmetic changed. The primary threat was no longer a lone rifleman hidden in the jungle foliage. The threat was the Soviet Union. Military planners looked toward the Fulda Gap in Germany, the most likely invasion route for Soviet forces pushing into Western Europe. If World War III broke out, the skies over Europe would be filled with advanced Soviet radar, surface-to-air missiles, and the devastating ZSU-234 anti-aircraft tank. If a Kiowa pilot popped up over a tree line to look for enemy tanks with a pair of binoculars, he would be vaporized by radar-guided cannons before he could even key his radio. The scout helicopter needed to evolve. It needed a way to see without being seen. In the 1980s, the Army launched the Army Helicopter Improvement Program, or AHIP. They took the existing, aging OH-58 airframes and completely gutted them. They upgraded the engine, reinforced the transmission, and added a four-bladed main rotor to make the aircraft quieter and far more agile. But the true genius of the AHIP program, the invention that birthed the OH-58 Kiowa Warrior, was the mast-mounted sight. It looked strange. It was a large spherical pod mounted on a hollow pole that extended straight up through the main rotor hub. To an outsider, it looked like a beach ball glued to the top of the helicopter. To an Army tactician, it was the greatest technological leap in scout aviation history. Before the mast-mounted sight, a helicopter had to expose its entire fuselage, cockpit, engine, and rotors to look over a hill or a building. With the mast-mounted sight, the geometry of survival was rewritten. Inside that sphere was a high-resolution television camera, a thermal imaging sensor that could see heat signatures in pitch darkness, and a highly advanced laser rangefinder and designator. Because this incredible sensor package sat above the spinning rotor blades, a Kiowa pilot could fly behind a dense forest, a steep ridge, or a cluster of buildings and establish a hover. Slowly, carefully, the pilot would raise the aircraft just enough so that only the spherical sight peeked over the obstacle. The entire helicopter and the crew inside it remained completely hidden from the enemy. From miles away in the dead of night, the Kiowa could watch Soviet tank columns moving. It could identify command vehicles, and most importantly, it could destroy them without ever firing a shot. Using the laser designator inside the sight, the Kiowa crew could paint an enemy tank with an invisible beam of coded laser energy. Miles behind the Kiowa, safely out of range of enemy air defenses, an Apache helicopter could launch a Hellfire missile high into the air. The Apache didn't even need a line of sight to the target. The Hellfire missile would fly over the battlefield, detect the laser energy reflecting off the tank, and ride that beam straight down for a catastrophic kill. The Kiowa could also laze targets for fast-moving fighter jets, and for the brand-new Copperhead laser-guided artillery shells. The Kiowa was the ultimate sniper's spotter, but the Army wasn't finished. As the AHIP program progressed, commanders realized that a scout helicopter sometimes needed to defend itself. Pylons were added to the sides of the aircraft. Suddenly, the scout could carry its own Hellfire missiles, pods of 2.75-inch Hydra rockets, air-to-air Stinger missiles, and a .50 caliber heavy machine gun. The observer had finally become a warrior. Prime chance in the Desert Storm. The newly armed and upgraded OH-58 Kiowa Warrior was a technological marvel on paper, but it needed to be proven in combat. And its first major test came in an environment it was never designed for, the middle of the ocean. In 1987, the Iran-Iraq War was spilling into the Persian Gulf. Iranian forces were using small, fast speedboats to attack civilian oil tankers and lay naval mines under the cover of darkness. The United States Navy was tasked with escorting the tankers, but they had a serious problem. Their large radar systems struggled to track the small wooden boats, and fighter jets flew far too fast to spot them at night. The military needed an aircraft that could hover in the dark, see through the night, and deliver precision weapons. They called on the Kiowa Warrior. In a highly classified operation known as Prime Chance, Army Kiowa helicopters and their crews were secretly deployed onto Navy frigates and floating mobile sea bases in the Persian Gulf. They traded their olive drab paint for naval gray. Every night, these Army pilots flew their single-engine helicopters out over the pitch-black water. They flew at an altitude of just 30 feet, using their night vision goggles and the thermal sensors of the mast-mounted sight to scan the waves. When they caught Iranian mine layers in the act, the Kiowas struck. They engaged the small boats with rockets and Hellfire missiles, completely neutralizing the threat. Operation Prime Chance was a massive success, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Kiowa Warrior's target acquisition systems were world-class. But the true validation of the Kiowa Warrior came in 1991, during Operation Desert Storm. When the Gulf War began, the world watched on television as Apache helicopters crossed into Iraqi airspace and fired the first shots of the conflict, obliterating early warning radar installations. What the news cameras did not show was the aircraft that guided them there. Flying alongside those Apaches in the total darkness of the desert were the Kiowa Warriors. The Kiowas navigated the intricate flight paths, found the radar sites, and lased the targets so the Apaches could fire their missiles from maximum range. Throughout the 100-hour ground war, the Kiowa fleet was indispensable. The Iraqi desert was vast, flat, and featureless. Iraqi armored divisions had dug their tanks deep into the sand, hiding them from standard reconnaissance. But they couldn't hide from the Kiowa's thermal sight. Flying far ahead of the American armored columns, the Kiowas systematically hunted down the dug-in Iraqi tanks. They called in massive artillery barrages. They lased targets for the A-10 Warthogs, and they used their own Hellfire missiles to destroy armored vehicles that threatened the advancing infantry. By the end of Desert Storm, the Kiowa Warrior had permanently silenced any critics of the armed scout concept. It was a phenomenal success, but the nature of warfare was about to change drastically, and the Kiowa would soon be forced to adapt once again. Sunsetting the Warrior by the year 2014, the OH-58 Kiowa Warrior fleet was exhausted. The airframes, many of which had been originally built in the 1970s, had been flown incredibly hard. They had been pushed far past their structural limits in the corrosive dust of the Iraqi desert and the thin, punishing air of the Hindu Kush. They were weighed down with decades of added electronics, heavy armor plating for the seats, and weapon systems that the original Bell engineers could never have imagined. At the same time, the military landscape was shifting. Budgets were shrinking dramatically. The Pentagon was forced to make agonizing decisions about where to allocate its resources. Maintaining a dedicated fleet of scout helicopters was becoming financially difficult to justify, especially in the face of a rapidly advancing new technology, the unmanned drone. Unmanned aerial vehicles, like the Predator and the Reaper, could launch from a runway, fly quietly to a target area, and loiter in the sky for 24 hours straight. They could beam high-definition, full-motion video directly to command centers half a world away, all without ever putting a human pilot in danger. In the eyes of the budget planners, the era of the manned scout helicopter was over. In early 2014, the Army announced the Aviation Restructure Initiative. It was a massive, sweeping change to the military's aviation assets. To save money and streamline maintenance, the Army made the controversial decision to completely retire the entire fleet of OH-58 Kiowa Warriors. The plan was to replace the Kiowa by pairing the AH-64 Apache with unmanned drones. The drone would find the target, and the Apache would destroy it. The announcement was met with fierce, emotional resistance, particularly from the infantry commanders and the ground troops who had relied on the Kiowa for survival. They argued that a drone staring through a soda straw camera lens from 20,000 feet could never replicate the situational awareness of a human pilot flying at 50 feet. A drone operator sitting in a dark, air-conditioned trailer in Nevada couldn't feel the tension in an alleyway. A drone couldn't establish eye contact with a squad leader on the ground. And most importantly, a drone could never aggressively dive in front of a platoon to draw enemy fire. The Apache, while an incredible machine of war, was criticized as being too heavy, too expensive, and too valuable to fly the kind of gritty, low-level, door-kicking reconnaissance missions that the Kiowa excelled at. But the decision was final. The phase-out began. Over the next 3 years, the cavalry squadrons began casing their colors. The helicopters flew their final missions. Many of the airframes were stripped of their classified technology and sold to foreign militaries. Croatia, Greece, and Tunisia bought fleets of used Kiowas. Other airframes were stripped for spare parts, and hundreds of them were flown to the Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group, the famous military boneyard in the searing heat of the Arizona desert. There, the rotors were removed, the windows were taped over, and the aircraft were left to bake in the sun, silent monuments to a bygone era of aviation. By late 2017, the very last U.S. Army Kiowa Warrior touched down for the final time. The doors were shut, the engine spooled down, and the flight line went quiet. Today, the modern battlefield is highly digitized. It is watched by silent, invisible drones, and it is dominated by massive, heavily armored attack helicopters. The era of the cowboy pilot, weaving through city streets with the doors off, firing an M4 out the window to protect his brothers on the ground, has officially come to a close. When military historians look back at the aircraft of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the OH-58 Kiowa Warrior might not be the most famous. It didn't break speed records. It didn't carry the largest payload. It was, in many ways, an underdog, a civilian airframe drafted into a brutal, unforgiving war. But military legacy is not written in specification sheets or budget reports. It is written in the memories of the men and women who came home because of that machine. To the high-level planners, the Kiowa was simply an aging piece of hardware that had been outpaced by the march of technology. But to the thousands of soldiers who fought in the valleys of Afghanistan and the streets of Iraq, the Kiowa Warrior will never be just a helicopter. It was a relentless protector. It was a strange little bird with a magic sphere on top that never ever backed down from a fight. It remains the scout that guided America's deadliest attacks, the ultimate friend to the infantryman, and the bravest aircraft to ever fly.